Laura had struggled for years to feed her two children. But when she found an abandoned baby in a luxury bag near a dump, her life took a turn she never expected. Weeks later, a group of men came looking for the baby, their cold questions striking fear into her heart. The next day, her world collapsed. What happened in that moment changed everything. Laura lay on a worn-out mattress, her skin pale and her breathing labored. The makeshift shack around her, with its tattered walls and broken roof, mirrored her fragile condition. The wind whistled through the cracks, and every breath seemed to take more from her. Her eyes flickered open, and for a moment, the pain in them was overshadowed by a distant, quiet hope. In a glamorous ballroom downtown, Jacob, with his flawless blonde hair and sharp suit, smiled for the cameras. The event he was hosting, filled with laughter, music, and opulence, was meant to showcase his success. In stark contrast to the shambles of Laura's world, Jacob's life radiated luxury, making the gap between their realities even more jarring. Laura's best friend, determined and desperate, stood nervously at the entrance of the charity gala. She gripped a letter tightly in her hand, her worn-out clothes and anxious face standing out amidst the sea of wealth and privilege. Her heart raced as she searched for a moment to approach Jacob, knowing this was Laura's last chance for salvation. Back at the shack, Laura coughed weakly, her body racked with exhaustion. The fragile roof above her creaked ominously, reminding her that even the place she called home was falling apart. Her mind drifted, wondering if her friend had found help, but fear gripped her as the cold truth of her isolation settled in. Jacob scanned the room, oblivious to the unfolding tragedy in Laura's life. He received praise for his philanthropy, but remained untouched by the real suffering just outside his privileged circle. A fleeting thought crossed his mind as he saw the woman standing nervously near the door, but it was quickly dismissed as he returned to his speech, unaware that his past was about to collide with his present. Laura remembered better days, when her health allowed her to care for her children. Flashbacks showed her working tirelessly to put food on the table, her body still strong and her spirit undeterred by hardship. She would tuck her children into bed, whispering promises of a brighter future, though she herself wasn't sure how she'd make it. Her life took a harsh turn as her health began to decline. What started as exhaustion soon became something much worse. Her once sturdy frame grew frail, and the strength she relied on vanished. The weight of her responsibilities only increased as she struggled to maintain her household and care for her children with a body that was betraying her. The poverty that always lingered on the edges of her life soon consumed it entirely. As her illness worsened, she was forced to make heartbreaking choices between buying food or medicine. Each day brought new burdens, and the toll it took on her body was undeniable. The hope she had once tried to instill in her children began to fade, as she could no longer shield them from their harsh reality. Amidst her struggles, a fragile light appeared, an infant left abandoned, whom she had found outside her door one rainy night. This baby, whom she named Jacob, became a source of both joy and sorrow. With no one else to care for him, Laura took him in, despite barely being able to care for herself. The bond they formed was immediate and unbreakable. In his innocence, she found a reason to keep fighting. As Jacob's wide blue eyes looked up at her, unaware of the hardships that defined their days, Laura would sometimes smile through her pain. She held him close, knowing that no matter how weak she became, she would protect him for as long as she could. The love between them was her last stronghold against the crushing weight of her illness and poverty. Jacob stood at the center of the lavish event hall, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room filled with donors. He radiated confidence, his perfectly tailored suit only enhancing his powerful presence. The air buzzed with anticipation, but Jacob was completely unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes, one that would bring his past colliding with his present. Near the entrance, Laura's friend fidgeted nervously, her hands trembling as she gripped the invitation. She was painfully out of place in her modest attire, surrounded by opulence and elegance. Her heart raced as she tried to gather the courage to approach Jacob, knowing the weight of the truth she carried. Her gaze followed Jacob as he moved effortlessly from one conversation to the next. Each step he took reminded her of the growing distance between them. He, a man of influence and wealth. She, a woman tied to the fragility of Laura's existence. Her pulse quickened as doubt crept in. Should she even tell him? As Jacob continued his rounds, every interaction felt calculated, yet natural. He smiled politely, shook hands, and exchanged pleasantries with ease, his mind focused on the success of the night. But beneath his composed exterior, he had no idea that a figure from his past was watching closely, prepared to reveal a hidden truth that could change everything. Laura's friend finally took a deep breath and stepped forward, her feet feeling heavy as she closed the gap between her and Jacob. Her palms were slick with sweat, her heart pounding as she rehearsed her words in her mind. This was it. This moment would either save Laura or send everything into chaos. Laura's friend hurried towards Jacob, determination in her eyes. She knew this was the only chance to help Laura. But as she got closer to him, 2 security guards appeared, blocking her path. Her heart sank as they motioned for her to step back, their faces stern, leaving her no choice but to stop. Frustration and fear mixed in her expression. She pleaded with them, her voice rising, but they wouldn't let her through. She glanced at Jacob, now out of reach, and felt her window of opportunity slipping away. Time was running out, and Laura desperately needed help. Desperate and with nowhere to turn, she thought quickly. If she couldn't talk to Jacob directly, maybe a note would reach him. She fumbled for a piece of paper, her hands shaking as she wrote a message, hoping it would be enough to catch his attention before it was too late. She carefully folded the note, eyes scanning the room for any way to leave it for Jacob. The urgency pressed on her as she slipped the note under his office door, praying he would find it and read it in time. With one last glance back, her heart heavy, she left the building, knowing she had done all she could. Now, all she could do was hope and wait for Jacob to notice the note. Jacob walked into his office, tired after a long meeting, and noticed something on the floor. It was a note, folded neatly, but he had seen things like this before, desperate attempts for help or money. He let out a sigh and picked it up without much interest. He unfolded the paper slowly, reading the few hastily written lines. His expression hardened. To him, it seemed like yet another plea for financial aid. His lips curled slightly in disdain as he tossed the note onto his desk, dismissing it without a second thought. For a moment, Jacob turned his back to the desk, ready to move on with his day, but something stopped him. A faint memory flickered at the edge of his mind, something that gave him pause. His hand hesitated over the note, almost reluctant to look at it again. Slowly, he turned back, curiosity beginning to creep in. His fingers brushed the note again, picking it up, and this time, his eyes scanned the lines more carefully. Something about the wording seemed oddly familiar, stirring something deep within him. As the memory grew clearer, Jacob's previously cold demeanor softened ever so slightly. The note wasn't just another cry for help. There was something more, and that realization sent a small shiver down his spine, as he knew he couldn't just ignore it. Jacob sat at his desk, the note still in his hand, and something stirred within him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the story in the note sounded eerily familiar. The words began to echo in his mind, triggering a sense of déjà vu. He frowned, staring at the paper as if it held more than just ink. As the memory nagged at him, Jacob's thoughts drifted back to his childhood. He had never known his biological parents. His adoptive family had told him that he was abandoned as a baby, found wrapped in a blanket outside a hospital. That memory now resurfaced, bringing with it questions he had long since buried. Scenes from his past played like flickers of an old film reel. He remembered asking his adoptive parents about his origins, and how their answers were always vague, as if they too had no clear idea of what had really happened. The sense of mystery surrounding his birth began to gnaw at him again, something he hadn't felt in years. Suspicion started to build inside him. Could the note be connected to his past? He had always dismissed the idea of ever finding out the truth about his birth, but now he wasn't so sure. His grip on the paper tightened as he struggled to make sense of the growing uncertainty. Yet, despite his suspicion, the full truth still eluded him. There were too many missing pieces, and Jacob didn't know where to start. He wasn't ready to face the reality that this note could be the key to unlocking a part of his life he never thought he would revisit. Laura's breathing grew shallow, and her body trembled under the strain of her illness. Her condition, already fragile, had taken a turn for the worse, and without urgent care, her life now hung by a thread. She lay in her small, cluttered apartment, her strength fading with every passing moment. Meanwhile, Jacob sat in his office, staring at the note once more. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this might be connected to something bigger, something about his own life. After a brief moment of hesitation, he made up his mind to investigate. The decision weighed heavily on him, and he knew it could change everything. When Jacob approached his team to discuss the note, their reaction was far from supportive. His closest advisor raised an eyebrow, expressing concern. "Jacob, this sounds dangerous. You don't know who this person is or what they want. I wouldn't recommend getting involved," they warned, their skepticism clear. His hesitation grew. The skepticism from his team made him second-guess his decision, and doubt started to creep in. But deep down, he felt a responsibility to do something, even if it meant risking his own peace of mind. Time was running out, and he couldn't shake the urgency he felt. Every minute he delayed, Laura's condition worsened. The weight of the decision pressed harder on Jacob's shoulders. He knew he had to act quickly, but with so many unknowns, hesitation lingered, threatening to cost Laura her life. The stakes had never been higher. Laura's friend rushed back to the small shack, her heart pounding with fear. Inside, she found Laura barely conscious, her breath ragged and shallow. The dim light from the single bulb flickered, as if echoing Laura's fragile state, and her friend's eyes filled with tears at the sight of her deteriorating condition. Desperation clawed at her heart, knowing that time was running out. She knew she had to act fast. Gathering what little strength she had, she stormed into the office of Jacob's assistant. Her voice broke as she pleaded for help, pushing past the cold, indifferent exterior that had previously stopped her. She laid out everything, the truth, the pain, and the urgency, hoping against hope that this time someone would listen. Jacob's assistant, though initially unmoved, could no longer ignore the intensity of her words. For the first time, they faltered, their hardened stance cracking under the weight of the emotional plea before them. There was a silent understanding, a brief moment where empathy overcame indifference. Meanwhile, across town, Jacob was drowning in the chaos of his business. Pressure mounted from every angle. Phone calls, meetings, and urgent deadlines blurred together, pulling him further from the decision he needed to make. The weight of the business world bore down on him, adding to the internal conflict that was tearing him apart. As the minutes ticked by, Jacob's thoughts wandered back to the note and the mystery it held. Despite the pressure from his business, a voice inside him whispered that time was running out for Laura. The stakes had never been higher, and Jacob found himself on the brink of a decision that could change everything. Jacob sat in disbelief, staring at the papers spread before him. The baby mentioned in the note, it was him. His hands trembled as the weight of the revelation sank in. His mind raced, trying to process how his past, which he thought he knew so well, could be filled with such secrets. The connection to Laura suddenly felt more complex than he ever imagined, leaving him grappling with uncertainty. He began piecing together the fragments of his childhood, memories he hadn't thought of in years. Images of his early life flashed through his mind, but with each recollection, more questions arose. Who had been there for him as a baby? How was Laura connected to him? And why had this secret been hidden for so long? The answers seemed just out of reach. With growing frustration, Jacob pored over every document and clue he had gathered. The information only led to more confusion. Why had Laura kept this secret? Was there more to his birth story than he ever knew? He had never imagined his life would take such an unexpected turn. As Jacob dug deeper into his past, he felt the tension rising. There was something missing, a vital piece that could explain everything. But the closer he got to uncovering the truth, the more elusive it became. Every new discovery seemed to lead to more mysteries, and Jacob found himself questioning everything. The connection to Laura remained unclear, and the urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that the answers he needed were tied to Laura's survival. His thoughts were consumed with the growing tension, pushing him closer to the brink of a revelation he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Jacob sat in his office, surrounded by his advisors. They spoke with urgency, warning him about the dangers of getting involved with Laura's situation. It wasn't just about the emotional toll. It could damage his business, his reputation. His eyes wandered, unfocused, as he struggled to process their words. Could he really turn his back on her now, knowing what he knew? His heart ached with indecision. The conflict between his responsibilities as a businessman and his growing emotional attachment to Laura was tearing him apart. His staff insisted that the risks were too great, but Jacob couldn't shake the image of her fragile state. His memories of the recent revelation mixed with his present turmoil, creating a storm of doubt. As the discussion continued, Jacob found himself slipping further into despair. The pressure from his staff was overwhelming, and he began to feel that perhaps they were right. Maybe there was nothing he could do to help her without sacrificing everything he had built. Hope was fading fast, and he felt the weight of defeat pressing down on him. Meanwhile, Laura's condition was rapidly deteriorating. With each passing moment, the hope for her recovery seemed to slip away. Her situation had grown increasingly dire, and though Jacob knew he had the power to help, the voices of reason around him were louder than his own conscience. The struggle between head and heart was nearly unbearable. By the end of the meeting, Jacob felt hollow. The risks had been laid out in front of him, and they were undeniable. But as he sat in silence, the thought of letting Laura go, of abandoning her in her most vulnerable state, gnawed at his soul. The future seemed uncertain, and for the first time in his life, he was unsure of what to do next. Jacob found himself alone in his office, the weight of the recent revelations pressing heavily on his mind. He stared out of the window, trying to reconcile the path his life had taken with the truth he had just uncovered. The success, the wealth, the power, everything he had built seemed to pull him further away from the person who had saved him all those years ago. The feeling of isolation deepened as he wondered if his achievements had blinded him to what really mattered. As he sat in silence, memories from his childhood began to surface. He saw flashes of his younger self, filled with innocence and curiosity, completely unaware of the sacrifices made for him. There was a warmth in those memories, reminder of the life that had nurtured him into who he was today. Yet, the face of the woman from the note remained distant, shrouded in mystery. The connection between the abandoned baby and his own life became clearer with each passing moment. Jacob's heart ached as he realized how far he had drifted from that part of his past. His drive for success had built a wall around him, distancing him from the very person who had given him a chance at life. In a moment of clarity, Jacob stood up, pacing the room. His thoughts raced as he pieced together the fragments of his life and the silent sacrifices that had been made on his behalf. He realized that his wealth, which he had always viewed as his greatest accomplishment, had come at the cost of losing touch with what truly mattered: his own origin, his connection to the past. By the end of the reflection, Jacob felt a strange mix of guilt and determination. He could no longer ignore the truth. The decisions ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt a pull back to his roots, to the person who had saved him. His reflection was over, but the journey to rediscover his humanity had just begun. As Jacob sifted through old records and letters, a familiar name began to surface more frequently: Laura Miller. Each time he read her name, a faint memory flickered in his mind. She had always been there, in the background, offering help in ways he hadn't noticed. A moment of clarity struck as he pieced together fragments of their shared past. The woman from the note was the very person who had saved him all those years ago. Small details, previously overlooked, started to fall into place. The tattered letter with a faint scent of lavender, The way she had always protected him from afar and the sacrifices made. Everything pointed to Laura. Jacob's heart sank as he realized the depth of her silent devotion, and the guilt began to creep in. Time was running out for her, and he knew he couldn't waste another second. Each clue he uncovered felt like a weight pressing down on him. His guilt grew heavier, knowing how much she had done for him without expecting anything in return. He had been blind to the signs, lost in his own world of success and ambition. Now, as the pieces of the puzzle came together, it was clear Laura had been the constant force that shaped his life. Desperation set in as Jacob thought of the time he had wasted, the opportunities he missed to thank her, to acknowledge her sacrifice. He knew he had to act, but the overwhelming guilt made it hard to move. The clock was ticking, and with every passing minute, he felt more powerless to make things right. Torn between his past mistakes and the urgency of the present, Jacob wrestled with his emotions. He knew what he had to do, but fear and regret paralyzed him. As the final clue fell into place, Jacob was left with no doubt. He had to save Laura, no matter the cost. Laura lay unconscious in the hospital bed, her breathing shallow and labored. The doctor's words echoed in Jacob's mind. Only a few hours left. Her once vibrant spirit now seemed so fragile, and the thought of losing her before he could make things right was unbearable. Every second felt like it slipped through his fingers, dragging him further away from a chance to fix the mistakes of his past. In the hallway, Jacob's assistant approached him, her face filled with urgency. She held a file in her hands, one more piece of the puzzle. As she handed it over, her voice broke. "You need to see this, Jacob," she whispered, her eyes pleading. She knew the weight of the decision before him and hoped that this final revelation would be the push he needed to act. The file revealed the sacrifices Laura had made over the years, quietly watching over him, even when he didn't know she existed. His assistant's words replayed in his head. "She saved you, Jacob," over and over again. The guilt tightened around his chest. His luxurious life, the comfort he had built, suddenly felt so hollow in the face of everything Laura had given up for him. It was too much to process, yet the truth was unavoidable. Standing alone in the sterile hospital room, Jacob felt utterly lost. Every material thing he had once cherished seemed meaningless now. He was trapped between the life he had built and the duty he owed to the woman who had shaped his very existence. His heart ached with indecision as he watched Laura's fading life force, knowing he had so little time to make amends. It was a breaking point. Everything seemed lost, and for the first time, Jacob had to choose. Continue down the path of comfort and ignorance or step into the unknown and do what was right. The decision weighed heavier than anything he had ever faced, and time was slipping away. As Jacob stood by Laura's side, watching her fragile form fighting for life, something inside him shifted. The pieces of his past came together, revealing the truth. She had saved him all those years ago, not just once, but over and over. A surge of clarity filled him. He owed her everything. Without her selflessness, his success, his entire life would not have existed. In that moment, he made his decision. Jacob rushed to find the doctor, his heart racing. He wouldn't let Laura go, not now. He gave everything he had, making sure that she received the care she deserved. His voice, usually calm and controlled, trembled with urgency as he explained her story to the doctor, revealing the depths of their connection. This wasn't just about saving a life. It was about repaying a debt he could never fully repay. As he sat by her bedside once more, the weight of his decision settled in. His entire life, built on the foundations of her sacrifices, had led to this moment. He held her hand, whispering words of gratitude and promises of a future where she would never have to suffer again. The tension that had gripped him for so long began to release, replaced by a quiet determination. Then, as if sensing his presence, Laura stirred. Her eyes, weak but open, found his. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was hope. Jacob's heart swelled with emotion, knowing that this was the start of something new, something better. The revelation that Laura's quiet sacrifices had shaped the man he had become was overwhelming, but it was also a gift of redemption and a second chance. The truth of their connection, once hidden, now stood clear as day. Jacob realized that his entire success had been made possible by her selfless actions, and now it was his turn to give back. As the sun set outside the window, casting a warm glow over the room, Jacob made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he would make sure that Laura's life, her sacrifices, and her love would not be in vain. Laura's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Slowly but surely, she regained her strength, her frail body no longer at the mercy of time. With each passing day, the bond between her and Jacob deepened. It was as if their lives had always been intertwined, a shared history that had come full circle. For the first time in years, Laura felt safe, knowing that Jacob would protect her, just as she had once protected him. Jacob made good on his promise. He arranged for Laura to live in a beautiful home, far removed from the hardships she had endured. The house was modest, yet warm, a sanctuary where she could find peace. No longer would she have to worry about where her next meal would come from or whether she would have a place to sleep. Jacob ensured her financial security, giving her the stability she had always deserved but never had. He wasn't just repaying a debt, he was building a future for both of them. The weight of their past slowly lifted, leaving room for new beginnings. Jacob, once consumed by his own success, now found purpose in caring for Laura. His work became secondary, a tool to provide for the life he now shared with her. They spent their days talking, reflecting on the lives they had led and how their paths had crossed in such unexpected ways. Their connection was no longer one of guilt or obligation, but of gratitude and respect. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch of Laura's new home, Jacob spoke of his plans to start a foundation in her name, a way to help others who had struggled as she had. Tears welled in Laura's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that her sacrifices had not been in vain. Jacob's success, built on her quiet endurance, would now serve to lift others out of the darkness she had once known so well. As the sun set, casting a golden light over the garden, Laura and Jacob sat in comfortable silence, knowing that they had finally found peace. Their shared history, once filled with pain and loss, had led them to a place of healing. Life, with all its twists and turns, had brought them back to each other, not as strangers but as family.